my title and aspirations about what I could present this year, and especially at these sessions, seem largely over-ambitious and would need almost a booklet, if not books. So what I will do today will be totally tentative and an attempt in terms of Versuch in German, or an essay, let's say, which is not a complete essay, to do something related to Arendt, Koselleck, and begreifen, thinking political concepts. And namely, I also thought that I would be managed to prepare a thorough presentation how and why Arendt's and Koselleck's thinking about political concepts meet, but that's impossible because when I dived into the material, I discovered that there is so much to be said, and for my surprise, there are so many similarities. So I was really astonished by how many parallels I found, but also differences, of course. I had to minimize these ambitions to the large extent, because I neither managed to read all relevant literature nor to make a consistent text. So I would just catch some points and commonalities, parallels, and point to a few differences that I found and think important in both thinkers, in how both thinkers approach to the contemporary thinking of concepts. And I will not make no reference to the state because that's just too much. And you all know that behind this lies a project which attempts to find out how Arendt relates to researching of changes in political conceptuality, especially the Koselleck approach. There are two levels on which I will just touch today on the topic. One is the question of direct connections between the two authors, which is rather one-sided, as only Koselleck refers to Arendt's work. The other are links arising from common, what I would call intellectual, historical horizon and socio-political experience of both authors, for whom experience is one of the central categories of their thinking. So when I first wrote the draft project, which was not funded at that time, that was 2010, which means 10 years ago, there was no study on the topic yet, but there are quite a few now. So in the paper, when it will be finished, in addition to the original work of both authors, I will draw from 4 to 5 main sources, some of which deal with this topic in detail. For example, what they do, they try to compare the question of a similar anthropological basis in both authors, relying on, as I said, experience as one of the central categories, or the question of understanding of politics and political, and then of course this work necessarily goes into direction to make a deeper a study of how both authors relate to Schmidt, Hobbes, and political tradition, of course also Hegel. But for Koselleck, Schmidt and Hobbes are the point of the beginning, I would say, also Hegel, whom I will touch today a little bit more, and maybe this will make Mirt happy because he will talk tomorrow about Hegel. And then the question of understanding the tradition and its crisis, the rupture, repetition, and continuation, and particularly the critique of the philosophy of history. And finally, both authors are tackling the question of the relation between historical thinking and political theory, and the need, and they underline, and Koselleck does this really, I would say, through the whole of his work, but the end of his life especially. So how, and the need, so the relation between historical thinking and political theory, and the need for political theory as political science. So this last point is, however, in authors that I've read by now, rather mentioned than analyzed. So I hope I will be able to analyze exactly this point. not here in front of you. I will just mention some things, and I think it really deserves it. But I will start at the beginning with one very interesting information that you might, it might be interesting for you. In 1996, Reinhard Koselleck held a laudatio to François Furet in Bremen, when Furet was awarded Hannah Arendt Prize für politisches Denken. In the laudatio, and I have it copied because I asked Peter Rüdel to send me. It's not available. It was published in one book, which was inaccessible for me. It was not in the libraries. It's 4 pages of text. And then Peter, whom I know because he's taking care of Hannah Arendt Prize at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. It was so nice that he copied these 4 pages for me so that I could read them. And in this laudatio, Koselleck really heavily underlined the influence that Hannah Arendt thinking was supposed to have upon his writing. And he spoke also about personally meeting Arendt when organizing a lecture of her in Heidelberg in 1956. So he vividly describes this event. But then I have read one recently, last year, published booklet by a German historian, I think, Sebastian Humholtz, who wrote an exciting text after exploring in details the factuality of these Koselleck claims, and discovered that there is no evidence whatsoever about such lecture. So he was writing to Ursula Lutz, he was exploring historical, the archives, etc., and all biographies, trying, Denktagebücher, everything. He couldn't reconstruct this. Moreover, it seems quite impossible that Arendt would have visited Heidelberg in that time. It seems therefore that Koselleck really appreciated Arendtian thought to a high extent, and especially her approach to tradition and critique of a philosophy of history, and wanted to be seen as strongly influenced by Arendt. The Humholtz study, which is also an effort, and a very interesting effort, unfortunately is written in German only now, an effort to emancipate Koselleck from the common assumption that he was a complete Schmittian, which was for a long time, and this is something that is going through several receptions of Koselleck. They all start, he was a pupil of Schmitt, so Schmitt was his mentor, which is not true at all. So Humholtz in detail really shows, how this assumption about Koselleck is mistaken, and puts him into the tradition of Schmittian thought, and also into the tradition of Schmittian misinterpretation, for example, of Thomas Hobbes, while he is talking about the concept of political and about the state, about political theology, etc. But Humholtz also attempts to free Koselleck from the accusations that his thought was retroactively liberalized. So liberalized by, by this thesis of Koselleck himself, that he is more closer to Arendt than to Schmitt. So he really nicely shows where Koselleck stands in relation to Schmitt and in relation to Arendt. And he shows so he shows how Koselleck was not how he didn't liberalize himself, and he doesn't need liberalization, because I would say now, with the terms that we were using in this seminar, he was liberal from the very beginning and not Schmittian, so, which of course Zoran will like very much. And this is also, and that's also interesting, this is also the point of critique. The question of liberalism, the question of Hobbes, is also the first point of meeting between Koselleck and Arendt, because Koselleck, in his dissertation and later published book Kritik und Krise, addresses Hannah Arendt reception of Hobbes in Origins of Totalitarianism, whereby he criticized her reception. So, and Huhnholz basically says that her reception of Hobbes there is more Schmittian than Koselleck's reception, which is very interesting claim. So, and now I want to go back to Laudatio. I need some space because I will quote some German, try to translate it later. I didn't really have time to I would have to type it, translate it to English, so I will do this ad hoc. So in the Laudatio, Koselleck underlines how important the discovery of Arendt's analysis of origins of totalitarianism was for him and his generation. And then he says, I mean, we can cynically understand this sentence, Heidegger and Lukács, I'm quoting, Kojève and Jasper still operated in the run-up to the catastrophe. This was not the case with Arendt. So she moved on, and Huhnholz also says later, you know, when they were doing this and this, she was already writing the human condition, so she really moved further. But because the reason was because she, in the Origins of Totalitarianism, started this really important analysis of the elements. On the other hand, there are no indications that Arendt ever read Koselleck's writings, Critique and Crisis, for example. But still there are, as I said at the beginning, for me, the striking similarities between the two authors, and also the difference, but I won't go deeply into them at this point. In fact, if we think of Arendt's approach to the research, I will state one after another these similarities maybe before I go further. So what are these different common points, I would say? So first is, as I already said last year, and which is quite obvious also from both theories and also from the reception, this idea about the break of tradition, about the gap, about the rupture within the tradition which exists. And this is very common. The second thing is the focus as a beginning of thinking about where this conceptual change in terms of theory, in terms of, let's say, Koselleck is broader, like he takes social sciences, and started at the point of, the beginning point is the French Revolution as the break in the modern European history, but also, and that's parallel also then what they both say about Hegel. So I will come to this later, with which I hope I will open also tomorrow Meets Meert's presentation.
Day after tomorrow.
The day after tomorrow, sorry. So then we have the critique, the point of history, how we understand history, what is history about, how to approach historic research. And then there is a strong point in the critique of the approach to the history as a philosophy of history. So they both go there, while I would say taking as a starting point Hegel, which is very interesting because we all think usually, and there is, I think, also a prejudice that Hannah Arendt was such anti-Hegelian. He was not. I think, and I wrote about this in Hannah Arendt handbook already. I will point to some things today, maybe today, to some things of this. Then the next point of the next very strong commonality is the focus on experience, Erfahrung. So as you know, Koselleck has got this claim that you know what happened with the Sattelzeit, which was for him the break in tradition, is that there was a rupture in tradition between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation. So between what we experience right now and what is seen as expected future. So, and there he actually criticizes utopian thinking and philosophy of history, because he says that the perception that we have now situation where the present and the past are determined by the future, basically, by the future expectations. So there is a strong parallel here. And then we have such points as, for example, that Koselleck appropriates Arendt's concept of natality into his thought in order to conceptualize the question of the new beginnings and events against the understanding of the history as the process. So, and in his development, I would think of his theory of historic, which is actually history in pluralities. And he basically takes this concept of natality into these three, I would say, these descriptions of what we could call in Arendtian language the human condition, let's say, in his historic. So he has these three levels, which are, some of them are taking, it's interesting because it's a mixture taken from Schmidt and Arendt and from Hegel, I would say, of concepts. So we have, and from Marx, of course. So we have if I will remember now, so we have within and outside, we have above and below. So within and outside is basically Schmidt, friend and foe, etc. Above and below is basically Hegel and Marx. So we have this dialectic of Knecht and Herr, English, German, mixing here, and what is the third one? My goodness. Oh, and then the third one. So, but I would say that this, and then he appropriates Arendt's concept of natality. So, so there is one text, particularly already, which was written in 2011, where the author compares this, what he calls historical anthropologies of both authors, which is very interesting. And then we have, yeah, and then we have what came into my mind as a very strong parallel also, is that Koselleck speaks, when he is speaking about his concept of historic, about in plurality, about possible future, about possible histories. And it immediately came into my mind how Arendt actually understood politics as a possibility. So as something that does not exist right there in a certain space, but something that we act out when and if we are politically active. So if we are, act as political beings, and I think, and also in this point, also a strong underlying, which is actually comes from the Aristotelian tradition, where he differentiates between things that can be changed and things that cannot be changed. So, and things that are in the realm of human affairs can be changed. So here we have this Arendtian saying that things could have been different if people acted at that time differently. So it's about possible history, politics as possibility, and also the fact that not everything must happen as it happened, but it could have happened differently, because there was actually no necessity in the history. So there is no inbuilt process of necessity of how things develop, which is actually the starting point of Arendt's analysis of the origins of totalitarianism. And then finally, I would say what is in common is, and I would see this as a kind of how do you say, lock, you know, the
arch.
arch of their thinking. Both of them actually start with a critique of the philosophy of history, and then they finish with underlining the need for political theory as a science, I would say. So we could say that Koselleck's historic, as far as it is not developed as a theory in the whole, as you know, as a consistent theory in the book, etc., could be explained as a kind of the Koselleck's political theory as well, although it's explained in terms of history, still in terms of history. So I think that we could, and also additionally, if we take a look at both authors' way of writing, we can see, except for the, you know, this immense work on geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, which is a special case, and I'm not going to this right now, that both Koselleck and Arendt had a style of writing which is basically not systematical. So it's a kind of specific historical analysis, which Goraz described yesterday, he likes very much, and which is not a systematic theory or a system, but rather, and I'm quoting now Koselleck, who is praising Arendt in his speech in this Laudatio. So not a systematic theory or a system, but rather essays and concrete as examples and analysis. So he is actually praising. He's praising Fourier while saying that he does the same as Arendt, but at the same time we can see that this is something he identifies strongly with. So we could say that actually Koselleck is also an essayistic writer. And, you know, a paradox, of course, is when I was applying for the project that, you know, we are working on now, I got it rejected. And there was one review of the project where the author was saying that you cannot compare Koselleck with Arendt because she's not a systematic conceptual thinker, and Koselleck quasi is. And then now, I mean, and then I had still this prejudice when I was starting to, you know, read Koselleck more closer, and then I saw, I mean, basically, I mean, that's not true. I mean, his theory, his approach to how he thinks is basically very similar to Arendt. So it's interesting. I mean, Arendt never wrote a book about politics, although she wanted to, but she never succeeded. Koselleck never wrote a book about historic, so there is a strong parallel. And there is therefore a lot to be said about the relationship between both authors. Yet I would want to, in the second part of this talk, I would want to go basically to one question. I would like to point out what are the commonalities between Arendt and Koselleck while speaking about conceptuality and concepts. Maybe also tackle the question, where does their confrontation with conceptuality come from? But I don't have time to go into this. There's where my title comes in. So both Arendt and Koselleck use in German the term begreifen for understanding or comprehension. So if you read them in English, you have comprehension or understanding. So you don't come to begreifen point. So if you don't know this link between begreifen and understanding, you cannot basically link them to Hegel, etc. So you would go and you would say Arendt is anti-Hegelian. And this is only one point, of course. Both of them relate the concepts. So through this approach, the concepts are linked to worldly experiences. This is in fact where the term Begriff concept originates. Hegel, and now I'm taking this from one very good article about conceptuality in Koselleck, and where the concept of concept comes from, Olsen. So Hegel particularly introduces this term in his Logic, while pointing to the important role of predicate for any definition of concept. For both Koselleck as well as Arendt, concepts do not antecede the way in which they manifest themselves in reality, and are not defined a priori without a link to concrete predicates that are attributed to them in concrete circumstances. So Koselleck says, and this is already, I mean, this is already speaks about his criticizing thinking in terms of history of ideas, and his relation to the conceptual history is not thought in terms of the history of ideas, but rather as a critique of the history of ideas. So in Koselleck, only when a term or idea gains diverse particular connotations does it become concept. Or to quote, a word becomes a concept when the plenitude of a politico-social context of meaning and experience, and for which a word is used, can be condensed in one word. So it's basically very simple. So a concept is then nothing but very semantic web woven through the series of its changing definitions, which are deposited in it and become reactivated in the present when we use it, of course. So when we say the state, or we say politics also, so they get reactivated. And so basically the logical, and this is again going back to Olsen, he says the logical expression of Koselleck's concept of concept, like Hegel, is a disjunctive judgment. Arendt explains her notion of begreifen already in the introduction to the origins of totalitarianism. So I have to say, so begreifen, if we would try to translate it not into comprehension or understanding, would be to grasp, basically, because it is about really literary, comes from greifen, and it's like grasping. We have in Slovenian, and I think also Croatian has a good, can be integration. How is it in Croatian, the translation of begreifen into Poimiti. So yeah, it comes from concept. So yeah, yeah.
To get to the poem concept.
Yeah, it's to catch the.
So it has to be poem because it's.
Yeah, it's literally. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be poem. It can be in Croatian. It has to be. I don't know.
It needs to be poem. In Slovenian, it's like.
Yeah, but in this we are talking about concepts, and poem is a concept. So it will be perfect translation exactly. Okay. You get it with the concept, not with the.
You grasp. You just you get to it basically.
That's
on the. Okay.
So you
can we continue with the presentation, please?
Okay. No, it's fine. So Arendt explains her notion of begreifen already in the introduction of the origins of totalitarianism. Now we have already here, we can see how conceptualizations and concepts get lost in translation, of course, because we have two versions of the book. We have English version and German version, and in German version, of course, the concept, the begreifen, is used, and in English it is not. So I will, English version, the term comprehension is used. So understanding could be another, but and the German version was revised and written by herself, and this is anyway in the introduction to both versions. So now I will open this, both parts. So this is, I will first read the German version, and it's a little bit different. And she says, begreifen bedeutet freilich nicht, das Ungeheuerliche zu leugnen, das Beispiellose mit Beispielen zu vergleichen oder Erscheinungen mit Hilfe von Analogien und Verallgemeinerungen zu erklären, die das Erschütternde der Wirklichkeit und das Schockhafte der Erfahrung nicht mehr spüren lassen. Es bedeutet vielmehr, die Last, die uns durch die Ereignisse auferlegt wurde, zu untersuchen und bewusst zu tragen und dabei weder ihre Existenz zu leugnen, noch demütig sich ihrem Gewicht zu beugen, als habe alles, was einmal geschehen ist, nur so und nicht anders geschehen können. Kurz, begreifen bedeutet, sich aufmerksam und unvoreingenommen der Wirklichkeit, was immer sie ist oder war, zu stellen und entgegenzustellen. And here we already have the question of the critique of the philosophy of history. We have the question of experience, and we have a kind of thinking about concepts as something that is already fighting against what it is, I would say. So it's quite an understanding of concept is quite radical, as also in Koselleck, where he says basically that concepts with a break in tradition actually also became so political that, you know, you fight through them and with the concepts. And in English version, this is still, so sorry, we have, she starts differently. So the first, so it's the first, in the paragraph, the first sentence is somehow added. She says, the conviction that everything that happens on earth must be comprehensible to man can lead to interpreting history by commonplaces, which is very interesting, because if we take the Koselleck's understanding of what conceptual history should do, we see that actually with the development of his approach, he didn't insist on interlinguistical understanding of the concept, but he not only moves to say that they are historically, socially and politically conditioned, but also he at a certain point moved to the extra-linguistic research, which was basically the question of concentration camps as something that is not comprehensible in terms of begreifen with concepts. It's very interesting because there is a strong parallel here, because Hannah Arendt also says this, you know, she starts with this, how can we understand, how can we begreif, how can we, the concentration camps. The more interesting parallel is that in this particular essay, where he deals with the question of dreams in the concentration camps, which is very parallel to Primo Levi's thinking about you know, what he was dreaming in concentration camps when he came, for example, he came back from, in the concentration camp, he was always dreaming about being free, about not being there. But when he returned home to Italy back, he was always dreaming the concentration camp. So that horror, this shows the horror. And basically what Koselleck was doing, he took Charlotte Berat's book, a book about where she collected, I don't know how many dreamers, stories about dreaming in a concentration camp. By the way, Charlotte Berat was a good friend of Hannah Arendt. She was translating her works, was intimately connected to her in several regards. So it's very interesting here, and I don't know whether anyone researched how much this, because he knew Charlotte, how much this connection between Koselleck and Charlotte Berat actually contributed to his, you know, appreciation of Arendt, how he understood Arendt, etc., etc. So I haven't found anything about this yet. So, so this is the first sentence. The second, so then she continues and says, comprehension, begreifen, does not mean denying the outrageous, deducing the unprecedented from precedents, or explaining phenomena by such analogies and generalities that the impact of reality and the shock of experience are no longer felt. It means rather examining and bearing consciously the burden which our century has placed on us, neither denying it, its existence, nor submitting meekly to its weight. Comprehension, in short, means the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. So basically, I would say we could take this paragraph, this statement, as an Arendtian approach to how to deal with concepts. So I don't have much time left yet anymore, so I should slowly go to the conclusion. I didn't come very far, actually. But maybe I should say some few things more. And also I would like to read from, yeah. No, I'm not going there. So both Koselleck and Arendt substantially build on and at the same time differentiate themselves from Hegel. Arendt, while reading Hegel to the large extent through Marx, and that is to be underlined because she is somehow going, and that's the problem with her reading of Hegel to the large extent. On the one hand, finds him as the first philosopher of the modern time who has returned to the importance of human action. Arendt says, literally in the On Revolution, that I'm quoting, I don't know if I'm quoting, well, maybe I took this from Slovenia or whatever. The birth of the modern history, of modern notion of history in Hegel's philosophy became the most far-reaching consequence of the French Revolution. So what? So she says, not, you know, it's the consequence of the French Revolution was Hegel thinking, and that was one of the most important things. And on the other hand, she points to the Hegel's notion of temporality, which completely changes the notion of historic time. At the same time, why, after discovering, you know, the human action as the most important thing that moves history, basically, she says he again translates politics as the most important dimension of human experience into the perspective of philosophy of history. Although not straightforward, Hegel's line of the progress of the spirit as a kind of temporal, and his kind of temporal speculations fit perfectly to the modern concept of history, and this view of reality created by the late modern age, which is basically the thinking in terms of progress. So, although while it is in contrast to the previous periods of cyclical time, he somehow goes back, although he has his dialectics, although through his dialectics the history is moving like this, but it's still going into this direction of, let's say, progressive. For Koselleck, the diverse particular predicates denoted, while Koselleck also discovered in Hegel, you know, this important, I would say, substratum where he could start from to think about concepts. So he is Hegelian, but at the same time, for him, particular predicates denoted by a term like state form not a closed system, but a sequence that is always open to new possible definition. So, also on whom I'm relying here says, and I'm quoting now, and this is so not, as Hegel thought, merely due to strictly epistemological limitations, the fact that the reason cannot gain an insight into all that is contained in a concept, which Hegel would like to have, of course, because his immense work is basically going, as Arendt says, into the direction to somehow suck the whole work into his conceptual system. So it's not due to strictly epistemological limitations, but rather to ontological ones. The historical sequence of the changing definitions of a concept is not simply the external manifestation of that which is already immanently contained in it. For Koselleck, the concept is always constructed and not discovered and not revealed in a history. So it's the same as in Arendt. So it's not about looking back how actually some kind of teleological process developed, but it is always revealed anew. So both Koselleck and Arendt develop in their, I would say, works that they published from the 50s to the end of 60s, let's say, both of them develop, they dedicate a large part of their analysis to the critique of the philosophy of history. And I'm not having time now here because I have to conclude. Koselleck is very nicely referring to this in his Laudatio, so I'm not going I'm not going to read about here. Interestingly, it is that, for example, when Koselleck writes about his text in Just the Future's Past, Historia Magistra Vitae, he starts with the same quotation Arendt uses in the beginning of her Between Past and Future, and he obviously was using her texts in German, the 4 essays where she was writing about history and tradition, so about the philosophy of history basically, when he was approaching this issue, and he starts with the quotation from Tocqueville, so that the future is not anymore, how is it? I can't recall. The future is not anymore enlightened by the past, but we are now moving in the darkness. So something like this. I cannot recall it literally. Preteklost ne razsvetljuje več prihodnosti, duh koraka skozi temo is in Slovenian. So the spirit is going through the darkness, so to speak. And also he mentions also Droysen, so in his historic. So it's really so close, and there are really so many parallels. Like, you know, to add one last, I mean, and to stop talking with this. For example, while what did I want to say? No, I forgot. It's something about I think it's something about the revolution. So I'm not going to this. So I think I said enough. So to start with this and to try to show, you know, where this exploration about the parallels and differences in Arendt's and Koselleck's work could go.
Thank you, Vlasta. I think it's okay to stay here.
Okay.
Because, you know, you will answer the questions.
So you'll go here, I'll go here.
Yeah. So, yeah, you just stay here and I will just collect. So, Helgard? Okay, anybody else on Zoom?
Yes, please.
Okay, Helgard, Goraz, Wolfgang, yes?
Me.
Mirt.
Mir?
Now, I just wanted to say hello because I came later.
Helgard, excuse me, just a second to organize myself.
Hello, Yehoshua.
Yeah. Helgard.
No, I don't want to. I just forget me.
Okay, good. Okay, so Goraz, Wolfgang, Mirt. Okay. Anybody else on Zoom? Aha, Waltraud. Okay. Okay, so Vlasta, do you prefer to answer all together or one by one, or to collect also the other questions and then?
Let's collect the questions. We don't have much time
Okay.
anyway, so
Tony?
people should talk.
Tony, Zoran. Okay, that's it. So, yeah, let's start. Gorazd, please.
Thank you. I liked your presentation about the similarities of how Koselleck and Arendt understood certain political dimension in concepts, and also the relation between concepts and reality. And the main opposition of this approach was in your presentation, Hegel. But you were mentioning also the break in the tradition of political thinking, which is well-known topic thesis by Hannah Arendt. And I don't know what is the relation between what you were talking about, the status and the approach to the concepts, and this break in the political tradition.
Once more.
You were talking about similarities.
Just a question. What is the relation? Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, where is here in your presentation the break in the political tradition? Because you were presenting only the break in comparison to Hegel, to Hegel's philosophy of history.
Okay.
Wolfgang,
Let's
yes?
select.
Yeah, go, Wolfgang.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vlasta. This is a very inspiring presentation, which makes more and more curious to how to deal with these two authors and thinkers. I have two questions. The first is, when you compare those two thinkers, I think you are happy, I would be happy to find that Koselleck has a lot of similarities with Hannah Arendt. But what can you do with this insight? How does inspire Koselleck, Arendt, Koselleck? How do you get something new and more of this comparison? Is this a comparison, or is this a collection of same ideas? What are you thinking, what you want to do? The second point is, I think Hannah Arendt stands in a situation where she breaks with historicism and ideologies and so on, predominant in the first half of the 20th century. But today we have deconstructionism and many types of dealing with experience, with concepts and so on. What is the specific of Arendt in the debate today, in the struggle of different relationships to reality?
Okay, thank you, Mirt. It would be nice to see you while you're posing question, if it's possible. If it's not, then no problem.
Please allow me to show you just my voice. I have a lot of anxiety on Zoom.
Okay.
I will pose my question as a comment. I will try to be, let's say, advocatus diaboli of Hegel. Despite the fact that I agree on the critique of Hegel's philosophy of history, I'm not sure if the critique could be extended into his philosophy. To precise, in all his lectures in the Berlin period, from lectures on philosophy of right to lectures of aesthetics, he recurrently moves on two levels at the same time. One is, of course, the history of the field he's dealing with, so aesthetics, law, etc. But on the other, he does what, in the preface to the philosophy of right, labels simply as the task of philosophy. What is the task of philosophy? Is to understand, comprehend what it is, not what it was. So, the present.
Yeah,
and his recurrent definition is that what it is the idea. And the idea is not the same as concept. The idea is the concept and its realization, so it's reality, if you will. So my question is very simply, do, by your knowledge, Arendt or Koselleck distinguish between idea and concept, or do they identify both of them as synonymous, let's say?
Okay, thank you. Waltraud?
Thank you very much, Vlasta. Very inspiring paper. I like specifically the approach to Hegel and Arendt concerning the logic from Hegel. And I have just in suggestion, because this, how Hegel reads Kant's aesthetics with the distinction between determined judgments and reflective judgment. So you could use what Arendt calls primarily understanding, is basically how Hegel reads it, determined judgments. And when the development started, where a concept does not respond to reality anymore, reflective judgment is needed. And I think this is precisely what Arendt is doing, that she is looking for she's looking at traditional concepts, seeing their departing from reality, and using precisely this idea to work with reflective judgment, how Hegel and Arendt is using it. So the question of new or new concepts is always related to existing concepts and showing the elements within these concepts which do not respond to reality anymore. And I think this movement of thinking she is doing is precisely the interpretation of Hegel's interpretation and critique of Kant's concepts of judgment. I think that would be very useful to work with these two ideas. The determined judgment is basically the traditional concept, and this reflective judgment, you look what has changed within reality. It has to be changed or reorganized within the concept. If this idea, and now I use the idea, not involved in the Umfang, the Begriffsumfang, so to speak. I don't know what the word in English is. Just a comment, but I loved your paper.
Thanks. Tony? Yes, if you want, yes, of course. Yeah, just come here.
It's wonderful. One of this quote by that I found it. Actually, she doesn't start the between the past and future with it, but she uses it when she discusses Kafka.
It's in several places.
Yeah, it's in several
places.
And since the past has ceased to throw its light upon the future, the mind of man wanders in obscurity. That's the quote she keeps on coming back to. So I just wanted to make that remark. And I wanted to ask you just one very brief question. And I think I follow Wolfgang here and kind of thinking about where does this take Arendt and where does this take Koselleck, and kind of what are we going to get out of this project is more about, do you have like a clear research question that you're looking into right now, delineated, or is that going to come later when you start writing the paper, which I hope to read? That'll be it. Thank you.
Thanks. Zoran, would you like to come here? Yeah.
I think that my question is related to Gora's question, but we'll see that from a debate. I think that Gora asked a question about the novelty in what political thinking does. And I was thinking about the situation in which Hannah Arendt was struggling to comprehend something, to get to the concept which could help her to understand the phenomena which changed her life. And that's the insight that something historically absolutely new happened. And that's the birth of concentration camps. So I was really immediately inspired by this link between word which turns into a concept and concept turns into something new. Because what she did in the origins is she doesn't know how to comprehend concentration camps. And then she asks herself, well, what would be the word to play with? And the words that appear to her as unavoidable are evil and hell, so two theological concepts. So she moves from evil to radical evil, and then from radical evil understood in Kantian way to her understanding of radical evil. So there is a development of a completely new concept of what evil is for historically new phenomena. The same with hell. So she reinterprets hell. So I'm asking you whether you can comment my interpretation of Arendt as a development from word to concept and concept to her completely new interpretation of what evil is, as an attempt to get to the understanding of a completely new phenomena, with Gora's question, well, is it something that political theory always does? Is it something very Hegelian that when something happens, you have to explain it, and when you explain it in this way? Isn't this a reconstruction of what we always do when we try to understand and explain something that already happened, unlike the concept which happened right here, right now, or when we think about future revolution, something like that?
Okay, thank you. So the circle is closed now. Gora's opened some questions and Zoran somehow underlined it. So Vlasta, sorry.
Yeah, I did not finish, but I had this more about Hegel, but I didn't want to kill you with Hegel already today. And I just came there. I didn't want to focus on Hegel, but I just got there. So it was out of my intentions. So this is, how thought works, very similar to how action works in the real world, let's say. And these are all the right questions. So where is the break in the political tradition? So, and how this relates basically to Hegel. So let me start again with both Koselleck and Arendt. And also, Wolfgang asked, what is then so exciting about Arendt, if we can compare him with Koselleck, and it's all the same. So what's the difference, basically? I understood what's more in her, if I understood. And then also the question about whether I have a research question or not. I have a hypothesis. I will tell the hypothesis, but I don't know. I mean, it's not a research question. I rarely start anything with a research question. I always start to read, and then the hypothesis or research question comes. So it's not, and I think it's somehow according to the question of, how you methodologically approach the field of theory, if we call it like this, let's say. So Koselleck explored basically 19th century, and it is clear also that with his Begriffsgeschichte, he only came and concluded what, so he didn't follow the development of the categories in the 20th century. Therefore, there is this big question among German historians, etc., and these attempts that we have all over European, let's say, conceptual historians, etc., whether we should now start with the conceptual history of the 20th century. So this is what Christian Goelen in Germany started, but then there was this big discussion, and Saracen, who was mentioned yesterday, also participated. So that's very interesting discussion, I think, because the question is, what is the continuity and novelty within the concepts themselves? So and I think this is the discussion that's ongoing all the time. There's nothing new about this discussion. So it's somehow a continuous discussion. So this would relate, to what you approached. the question is rather, the question, so make a step further. So there is no 20, let's say the 20th history is not there. The 20th century is not there within this, not yet, let's say, but there are attempts within European research space. You know, there are several groups which are doing this, started from Palonen and then all over, let's say. I mean, some of them are building on Koselleck's school, some of them are building on the Pocock's and Skinner school. So basically it's between two, and we know what the difference is, basic difference is, etc., etc. So and no one by now only few people started to think about, you know, what could be the Arendt's contribution to this, if there is any contribution to this. Now Arendt says that the break in tradition starts in thought. So she speaks about breaking tradition in thinking and breaking tradition in the real world, let's say. So breaking tradition in thought, she says, starts with Hegel. He's the first who breaks with all what she calls the political tradition, which is not relying on action as a basis of thinking about politics anymore. So it's Hegel who returns to action. That's the most important thing. And in this, Hegel is, Arendt is Hegelian, definitely. So she will also, when she talks about concept, she relies upon what we have said, and this is, I think, what I said, because, and both Koselleck and Arendt said, say basically, you know, when we speak about the concept, it's not speaking about the idea. And that's also about continuation and novelty of concepts, of course, because if concept is a concept, it is supposed to be able, let's say, to somehow grasp the novelty as well, if I put it this way. The idea cannot do this, because so this is and this comes from Hegel, of course. I mean, there is no doubt this is the Hegel's philosophy, and he is the one who made a break in tradition in thought as a first, and then Arendt continues with Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, all of three of them in different fields, of course. So each Kierkegaard religion, Nietzsche morality, and Marx politics, of course, because he was the one who, and then she says, and she is basically criticizing Marx through Hegel, and that's basically, I mean, that's the question, you know, whether she relies on Hegel or not. And I have this here, and I want to read this. So I don't know whether it's exact translation or whatever. I had something in Slovenian, so it's all mixed, but basically you will understand it, I think. So Arendt reads Hegel together with Marx. The concept of history is essentially similar in both, although they are both contradictory, and at the same time their thought correlates. Hegel thought represents a springboard for Marx's theory of the self-creation of humanity. This is my translation from, I don't know, from German or for what. And for theories of the movement of history, those theories of the movement of histories that are incapable of thinking and imagining radically new beginnings. So novelty is a question of, on the one side, new beginnings, and on the other side of catastrophes. It is a dialectic where new society is always born from what the old society has within it, let's say, in Marx. And then she said what Marx did. Hegel's dialectic is transformed into a method in Marx and opens up the possibility of process thinking, so characteristic of the 19th century ideologies. Ideologies turn this historical necessity set in the concept of history taken by Marx from Hegel into a method of thinking itself. So we cannot discover anything new. Everything already happened. It's all the repetition of the old, etc. So the way we think becomes the processing of necessity, either natural or history. In other words, says Hannah Arendt, Hegel creates philosophical basis on which politics, so it's again, or I would rather say, can be replaced by anti-political mechanisms that transcended the realm of human affairs, blah, 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 blah. But not Hegel does this, it's Marx who does this. So we should basically read Marx through Hegel in order to understand what is it about history, concepts, etc., etc. So basically the novelty, I've lost myself in this quotation now. I don't know if it says anything at all. So basically, if we think in terms of, let's say, this process, historical necessity, there is never ever a novelty. So totalitarianism cannot be a novelty. It's not a novel form of government, as Arendt says. It is a repetition of tyranny, a repetition of dictatorship. So it's something that we've already seen. And this is how many people actually today, nowadays, approach the question of, what we see in the present. So, what is it now? How do we call this what we see in the United States of America? Is it Trumpism? What do we see in Slovenia? Is it Janšism? What do we see in Hungary? Is it Urbanism, etc.? So what they do is to call something they don't understand, and they probably sense as a novelty, because you sense somehow, at least if it's a novelty during your life, or if you deal with a theory, you also sense that there is something new about it. So if you don't, you'd rather go home and don't do anything anymore, I think. So basically it is, as Zoran said, something we call, but the question is, whether it can become a concept. I mean, there's a question. Yeah. So the question is, your question was whether Arendtian conception of evil is something that is a new concept. Simona Forti wrote a book about this, I think 3 years ago. Actually, she tried to show exactly this, that is a new concept of evil. And I do think that Arendt invented a completely new concept of evil, but not only, it's not about because she basically moved it from something that is seen as diabolic to the earth, and has shown actually what are the political elements, I would say, of the concept of evil. But however, with this, she was also able to think about the 20th century concepts of government and everything that comes from this in terms of novelty. Because I think basically the result of her book on totalitarianism is not the concept of evil, but what she starts to conceptualize as a novel form of government. So she says it is a novel form of government. She doesn't say exactly what it is. So it's bureaucratic, it's imperialistic, it has elements of the total domination, it has concentration camps. So we have all these elements, which she calls tentatively, I would say, a novel form of government. She doesn't say, how to call it really. So, but we haven't yet come to the conclusion how we should call this no form of government. So we still are dealing with, is it fascism? Is it, I don't know what? So is it, is it a repetition? Is it something new, etc., etc.? And I think here is where she made a breakthrough with a tradition and has really shown that it was not Stalinism, basically, but extinction concentration camps. So she didn't speak about two parallel forms of state systems of totalitarianism, but she merged all her analysis. So it's not about analysis of Stalinism or about analysis of National Socialism. It is about analysis of the new form of government, which somehow comes into both systems and into the systems we live right now. And this is why she speaks about the elements. So this, I think that this hypothesis about a new form of government is the most important result of the origins of totalitarianism, and everything else she does later is, and if we think in terms of political theory, we should relate to this to a certain extent. And just shortly, because I don't know, yeah, hypothesis, just this. So a research question. No, I don't have a research question. However, my hypothesis is that and Volker, they are different. I didn't come there yet. I think I will work out, you know, where actually I think that the main difference is that Koselleck, although he is underlining political action to the large extent, although we can interpret his historic in terms of a certain kind of political theory, is still thinking in terms of history. And he is a historian, so we cannot demand from him to make a political theory, I think. So my hypothesis basically is that there is a parallel which is strong, but there is also a difference, because historic is not political theory. Political thinking, I would say rather, Hannah Arendt used this, so it's political science. It is still historical science of history, let's say something like this. Walter made a comment which is wonderful. So it was actually, I think it was not a question. So I agree very much. It's interesting, though, for example, that Koselleck moved from Hegel to Kant, and Arendt also moved. So it's this movement from Kant to Hegel and from Hegel back to Kant and vice versa. So we have all this circling, I would say, circling around the Kant's and Hegel's, I would say, theory, where we see elements, where we see how both thinkers are using, I would say, are using concepts that emerge both in Kant and Hegel, of course. So,
okay.
And to me, I think I said this already in when I was talking, you know, that idea is not the same as concept. So definitely not.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ringo. I see that you wanted to say something, but I will leave to your, you know, to your conscience. I would like to end, you know, because we really had a great debate and we don't have much time. But if you really feel that you have to say, you know, I count that you are, you know, autonomous person that you can decide how much important. So please.
I make it short because I'd just want to say that my impression, and because of your wonderful talk, it's not only about history and Arendt and Koselleck, it's about futures, the future, what we can realize the possibilities in history for our future. I think this could be matched with a kind of hypothesis So that's what I want to say. Thank you.